welcome to the second Metaphysics lecture of term. We're going to be picking up today on where we left off last week. So if you remember last week, we discussed the so-called problem of change, or problem of temporary intrinsics. That is to say, how do you reconcile the notion that an object can exist identically over time with the notion that it also changes over time, right? So we saw that ordinarily when we think and speak as though regular objects like tables and chairs and planets and people and so on do persist over time. They do retain identity over time. It's still me who exists now who existed yesterday. And yet, we also acknowledge that they change their properties. It might be slowly in some cases, might be more rapidly in other cases, over time. So a sort of relatively extreme case was where we looked at the photos of the young Ian McKellen and the old Ian McKellen. And obviously, because those photos were taken about 60 years apart, Ian McKellen's features were rather different, and yet we still want to say that it's Ian McKellen. So how do we reconcile those two things? In particular, how do we reconcile them with what seems to be an intuitive principle, namely Leibniz's law? So Leibniz's law, if you recall, says that if two objects are identical, then they share. That is to say, if there's only really one object. So A and B are identical, then A must have all and only the same properties as B has. But with young Ian McKellen and old Ian McKellen, this seemed not to be the case. So this week, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the sort of prominent philosophical attempts to solve this problem, the problem of temporary intrinsics. Okay, so I'm going to just switch to the slides now. So hopefully that will make it easier to follow as we go along. Let me just put this up full screen. Okay, so the title of the lecture is Temporal Parts. So in particular, the Temporal Parts view, as we'll see, is one particularly prominent attempt to solve the problem of change, although we'll also see that there are others that respond to the temporal parts view. Okay, so this is just a bit of repetition of what I've just said. So it seems that we could have one and the same numerically identical object that changes over time. So young Ian McKellen and old Ian McKellen. We want to say, normally we'd want to say that's the same person, but just with different properties. In other words, the person's changed. And as I just said, this is in tension with Leibniz's law, otherwise known as the indiscernibility of identicals, that says if X is identical to Y, then X and Y have exactly the same properties. So that's just a recap of what the problem of temporary intrinsics or the problem of change is. Okay. So what we're really interested in for the purpose of this lecture is potential solutions to this problem. Now, this is a bit of sort of philosophical jargon that it's going to be useful to know, just because everyone uses it, I think, in the literature these days. So, broadly speaking, there are two main theories, philosophical theories, metaphysical theories, of how an object persists through time. That is to say, how it goes on existing identically across time. Right, so note that these theories both more or less presuppose that ordinary objects can and do persist identically over time. So another alternative would be to reject the idea that they do, but that's much less popular just because it seems so much in tension with our ordinary ways of speaking and thinking. So let's assume for the time being that we do want to defend the idea that ordinary objects exist over time, may have identity over time, even though there appears to be change over time. The two main philosophical theories that try to make sense of that are known on the one hand as endurantism, sometimes called three-dimensionalism, so two sort of technical terms used to describe the same philosophical viewpoint. And on the other hand, Pergerantism, or four-dimensionalism, which is a rival view of how objects persist through change. Okay, so each is going to give a different sort of solution to the problem of change, as we'll see. Okay, so what is Pergerantism or four-dimensionalism? Well, this is the view that actually ordinary objects, things like tables and chairs and people and planets and electrons and so on, are not merely three-dimensional objects. Rather, they're actually four-dimensional objects. So not only are they extended in the three spatial dimensions, as we might ordinarily take them to be, having height, width, depth, but they're also extended in the fourth temporal dimension. So they have temporal extent as well as spatial extent. Now, when we say that an object has spatial extent, we'd normally regard that object as having parts that are located in different places. So the idea would be my foot is a part of me, and my hand is a part of me, spatial parts. And of course, my foot is located in a different place from my hand, right? So the way in which I fill space, three-dimensional space, is by having different parts that occupy different regions of that space. Now, the Pergerantist thinks that ordinary objects have temporal parts as well. So, corresponding to the idea that they're extended in the fourth dimension, the temporal dimension, they have temporal parts that fill different temporal regions, just as they have different spatial parts that fill different spatial regions. So the idea is that, for instance, I have there's a part of me that exists right now. There was a part of me that existed yesterday. Hopefully for me, there'll be a part of me that exists tomorrow, and so on. So for them, persisting through time is like existing across a region of space. It's a matter of having different parts, in this case temporal parts, located at different places, in particular, in this case, different times. Okay, so I'll come back to an example in a minute, but one thing worth noting straight away on this view is that only a part, the implication of this view is that only a part of a regular object exists at any given one moment in time, right? So if you think about the spatial parts analogy, if we take a particular location of space, right, the location where my hand is, well, only part of me exists at that location, right? So it's only my hand. My foot, for instance, doesn't exist there as well, right? So if we take that region of space, only part of me is present in that region. The temporal parts theorist is going to say something similar about times, right? So they're going to say that actually only a part of me, a temporal part of me, exists today. And there are other parts of me that exist at different times, right? So the whole of me is made up not only by all of the spatial parts of me, but all of the temporal parts of me. So that includes today's part, but also yesterday's part, hopefully tomorrow's part, and so on. Now, the endurantist, the sort of rival view, or three-dimensionalist, says that actually, no, that's not right. Ordinary objects are three-dimensional, not four-dimensional. They're extended in the three spatial dimensions, but they're not extended in time. So the idea is just that persisting objects have spatial parts, but they don't have temporal parts. So that just denies the four-dimensionalist view. So they'll want to say that at any given time, an ordinary object is wholly present. It's not only a part of them that's present, it's not only a temporal part of them that's present, but the whole thing, the whole object is present at any time at which it exists. Nevertheless, endurantists still normally want to say that an object can persist identically over time, even though the whole of it exists at every moment. So normally this identity across time is taken as something that's primitive, that can't be further explained. In particular, it can't be further explained in terms of the objects having temporal parts that exist at different times. Now, we'll see that endurantism divides into several different versions of endurantism, and there's more to be said about each of them. But first, just like a quick illustration, if you think of this cartoon that shows a person aging over time, that's what it's supposed to represent. So you've got all the way from the baby in the pushchair to the old man in the wheelchair and all the stages in between. Then the Pergerantist's idea, the four-dimensionalist idea, is that the whole of the person consists of all of these stages, right? So the person is the whole thing, right, from the baby stage all the way to the old man stage. Sometimes it's called a worm view. So the idea is that the object, the person in this case, is like a spatiotemporal worm. There's a sort of, it has this sort of long extent, at least hopefully, has a long extent through time, as well as, for regular objects like people, a certain extent in space. So if you kind of drew the trajectory of this object through space and time, then the result would look like a worm. I guess the idea is that the temporal extent is going to look longer than the spatial extent for smallish objects like people, and so that the idea is that the person, the object, is the whole of the worm and not just a slice of it. Okay. So when it comes to Pergerantism, so the view's often motivated by way of an analogy. Well, I mean, we've seen one analogy already, right? So the notion of a temporal part is motivated by analogy with the notion of a spatial part. But you could actually give another analogy that also might help to get a grip of the notion of a temporal part. And that's the analogy with events, right? So if you recall, at the moment we're talking about the identity of objects across time, tables and people and so on. When it comes to events, it's actually less controversial that events have temporal extent as well as spatial extent. That, in other words, events have temporal parts as well as spatial parts. So to give an example, think of a football match. We'd ordinarily think of a football match as a temporally extended event. So it's an event that lasts or persists for 90 minutes plus injury time. And we'd fairly uncontroversially, I think, speak as though it had temporal parts. So it's common to talk about the first half of a football match, the second half of the football match, the 77th minute of the football match, and so on. So we're very used to talking of events as though they had temporal parts, and not just spatial parts. And I think we'd ordinarily be fairly happy to say that there's a sense in which the whole of the football match isn't present at a particular moment in time. So the 77th minute, for instance, only part of it's present then. So whilst it might be this sort of temporal parts way of speaking might be quite unusual when it comes to objects, actually it seems quite familiar from the case of events. And the Pergerantist essentially wants to model their approach to the persistence of objects over time on the ordinary understanding of the persistence of events over time. Okay, so just a little bit more detail on what the Pergerantist typically thinks. So, obviously, as I've said, they think that there are different temporal parts of an ordinary object existing at different times. Normally, they'll say that objects have both instantaneous temporal parts and temporal parts that are themselves temporally extended. So, for instance, an example of an instantaneous temporal part would be the temporal part of the Statue of Liberty that existed at precisely 12 noon today. As I speak, it's afternoon. The temporal part that existed of the Statue of Liberty at precisely 12 noon is a part, and it's an instantaneous temporal part because precisely 12 noon is an instant of time. But also, Pergerantists will normally want to say that an ordinary object like the Statue of Liberty might have, or does have, temporal parts that are themselves extended and not merely instantaneous. So they would think it's sensible to talk about the temporal part of the Statue of Liberty that exists throughout 2021. A temporal part that exists for a whole year, and ordinarily they'd want to say that the temporally extended temporal parts themselves have temporal parts. So, for instance, the instantaneous temporal part of the Statue of Liberty that existed at 12 noon today is part of the temporally extended temporal part of the Statue of Liberty that exists throughout 2021. So, just a sort of, I guess, a sort of simple way of putting it, you can think of ordinary objects as built up out of temporal parts, and those temporal parts are themselves built up out of further temporal parts, all the way till we get down to the instantaneous temporal parts. I think, that sort of model makes sense when we think about spatial parts. So, I have a part that's my hand, my right hand, say, but my right hand also has parts. For instance, the index finger on my right hand is a part of my right hand. And also it's a part of me, right? So the parts of my parts are parts of me. I guess that's the general principle. And obviously you might go further. So, my index fingers, got a knuckle, which is part of it. And you could carry on sort of decomposing right until, I guess, you got down to like a point-sized spatial part of me, which will correspond to an instantaneous temporal part of me. Okay. Now, all right, so we've said sort of a bit about what the Pergerantist view is, what it says. But how exactly does it account or deal with the problem of change that we've identified? Well, for the Pergerantist, change is to be understood as difference between temporal parts. So I'm switching the example slightly away from Ian McKellen. Going to consider a slightly different example, and the example is of a particular tree, which is called Hyperion. Now, Hyperion is a California redwood, and is reckoned to be the tallest tree that currently exists on the planet Earth. Now, Hyperion, so it's pictured on the right, and its height now is roughly 116 meters. Now, obviously, I don't have a photo of what it looked like 800 years ago, so it's about 800 years old. But we might sort of imagine that on Christmas Day, 800 years ago, roughly 800 years ago, Hyperion was a meter tall, just for the sake of argument, say that. Whereas now it's 116 meters tall. Okay, so now here we have a sort of a case of change, obviously, right? So Hyperion was a meter tall and now is 116 meters tall. So these are two different incompatible properties that we seem nevertheless to want to attribute to the same object, the same tree, namely Hyperion. So is this a violation of Leibniz's law? So on the face of it, it seems so. So what's the Pergerantist going to say? Well, the Pergerantist is just going to say, look, there are many temporal parts of Hyperion. There's a temporal part of Hyperion that existed on Christmas Day 1221 that had the property of being a meter tall. And there's a temporal part of Hyperion that exists now that has the different property of being 116 meters tall. So the way this helps, or the way that the Pergerantist is going to say this helps with the problem of change, is that there's just no contradiction between the idea that different parts of an object have different properties. So, for instance, it might be that my right hand has a particular freckle that my left hand lacks. But that's not a contradiction. It's no contradiction to say that my right hand has a freckle and my left hand lacks it, right? So there's nothing wrong with one part of me having a property that a different part of me doesn't have, right? No contradiction there. And the Pergerantist is saying, when it comes to change over time, they're saying exactly that. It just is. Change over time just does consist in different temporal parts having different properties. So the idea really is that the property of being 1 meter tall and the property of being 116 meters tall are not really properly speaking properties of a single object, namely the tree Hyperion, but rather they're properties of two different objects, namely different temporal parts of Hyperion. So I guess the analogy would be saying, well, being freckled is not properly speaking a property that I have. It's a property that, say, one of my spatial parts has, my right hand, that, for instance, my left hand, another spatial part of me, lacks. So no contradiction there, and the Pergerantist is going to say, by analogy, no contradiction in the case of temporal parts having different properties. So in other words, the changeable or temporary properties that objects possess are kind of not really strictly speaking possessed by the objects themselves, or maybe we could loosely speaking say they're possessed by the objects themselves, but strictly speaking what they're possessed by is the temporal parts of objects, and that's how they overcome the contradiction, or the apparent contradiction. Now, okay, so I guess many people take this to be an interesting solution. A lot of people do endorse it. Are there any objections to it? Well, I mean, maybe you can think of some of your own, but there are a number that have been raised in the philosophical literature. So one objection is that, and it is interesting that this theme will recur regularly when we consider different views of what it is for objects to change over time. So one response to the proposed solution by the Pergerantist is that actually it doesn't give us genuine change of objects over time. Actually, you might argue that really this isn't a view that endorses change over time, but rather sort of denies it. In particular, you might argue that really the Pergerantist is simply denying that objects have properties that change, right? So what it's saying, of course, is that ordinary objects consist of temporal parts that have different properties. So it's not the object itself that has these properties that change, but rather it's just different temporal parts of it have different properties. And the temporal parts don't change in their properties, right? So it's not as though the part of Hyperion that existed on Christmas Day 1221, which has the property of being a meter tall, it's not as though that temporal part changes its height property. It's not as though the Christmas Day 1221 part of Hyperion itself grows. All that's the case is that there are different parts of Hyperion that have different height properties. So you might think this is kind of like a denial of genuine change. Nothing really changes. There are just different temporal parts with different properties. And so no single object is actually undergoing a change, except maybe in a kind of derivative sense. So we might speak as though Hyperion changes or grows over time. And by this, we're just to be understood essentially as ultimately meaning that it has these different temporal parts with different properties. So you might think that this alleged denial of change is contrary to common sense. Okay. All right, so maybe we'll come back to four-dimensionalism or Pergerantism. But given this sort of objection, it might be worth looking at a rival view, or rather, I should say, a rival set of views, because endurantism is kind of a set of views, as we'll see now. So you might say, well, the endurantist, what unifies them is the idea that ordinary objects don't have temporal extent, even though they do have identity over time. They're not extended in time. They don't have parts that exist at different times. Rather, they're wholly present at each time at which they exist. So how could they solve the problem of change, or the problem of temporary intrinsics? After all, we still seem confronted with the idea that an ordinary object could exist at two times and would nevertheless be identical, but yet it would appear that it could have different properties at these two times. Now, basically, the various solutions offered by endurantists correspond to different versions of endurantism. So, in particular, there are sort of three, the three sort of most well-known or popular or influential versions of endurantism are Presentism, Relationism, and so-called Adverbialism. Probably the first two being the most popular. Adverbialism being one that's often discussed, but I guess there probably aren't as many people who endorse it as the other two at the moment. So Presentism is an interesting view that says that actually the only things that exist are those things that exist in the present. And more generally speaking, they actually say that only the present moment of time exists. So the past and the future don't exist. So maybe a kind of a little bit of a surprising view. So the past and the future don't exist. I think a lot of people are more comfortable with the idea that the future doesn't exist than that the past doesn't exist. This is a sort of theme that we'll come back to later in term when we'll talk about these sorts of ontologies of time. So whether just the present exists, whether the past, present, and future exist, or whether, for instance, the past and present exist but the future doesn't exist. But that's a topic for later in term. But presentism is a view that only the present exists, and so in a sense, this view. So I mean, obviously, kind of, it seems to follow that ordinary objects are three-dimensional, not four-dimensional, because really reality is only three-dimensional. Only the present exists, so it's only this the three spatial dimensions that instantaneously exist, right? So there's no temporal extent because there is only the present moment. There is no, if you like, real fourth dimension, because all that exists is an instant of time, and not an extended period of time. So it looks like for the presentist, actually the only properties that objects possess are those that they possess now, right? So Hyperion, for instance, has this property of being 116 meters tall, which is a present property. So the present Hyperion, which exists, has this property of being 116 meters tall. The sort of past version of Hyperion, the one that we were hypothesizing was a meter tall, on a particular day 800 years ago. Well, according to the presentist, that day 800 years ago and that past version of Hyperion don't exist, right? So there's a sense in which this view kind of avoids the problem of change entirely, because the sort of problem was that, well, how do we reconcile Hyperions having had the property of being 1 meter tall with the idea that it's 116 meters tall? Well, we in a sense we sort of reconcile it by denying that this 1 meter tall version even exists. So there's no problem with whether it's identical to the present version. It doesn't even exist, so there's not even a question about whether it's identical to the thing that does exist. So in a sense, presentism avoids the problem of change. Now, there are objections, and again, some of them might well have occurred to you. So one objection, and this sort of repeats a theme that we'll find maybe applying to all of the views that we consider. So I think for all of the views we consider, some people at least will argue that their views that don't do justice to genuine change or don't give an account of genuine change. So we saw that sort of charge could be leveled against the four-dimensionalist. But there's also a way in which it can be leveled against the presentist. So you might think, well, the presentist implies that change doesn't really happen at all. Well, why? Because you might think that, well, change is kind of difference over time. But those different past states and different future states of present objects just don't exist. All we have is the present state, and that's just the way it is, right? So the present state, is the 116 meter tall state in Hyperion's case. So how do we have genuine change if there's no other version of Hyperion with differing properties that exist? So you might argue that. I mean, you might also argue that maybe there's an even more fundamental worry, which is that presentism just seems to imply that objects don't persist over time, right? So you might argue that, right? So given that there's only one time that exists, the present, there just is no future or past version of Hyperion, say, for the present version to be identical to, right? So you might argue that the notion of identity across time just drops out of the picture because there are no past or future versions of objects. And if you find that persuasive, then I think it would be reasonable then to deny that presentism is actually a form of endurantism at all. I mean, it's normally taken to be a form of endurantism, but you might argue that, endurantism was supposed to be a theory of identity across time. And it's sort of supposed, like the other versions of endurantism and like Pergerantism, that there could be identity of objects across time. But if presentism just denies the existence of these past and future versions, then maybe there's nothing for the present version to be identical to. So maybe it's just not a theory of identity across time. So that's a sort of line one might push in critiquing presentism. Okay, so then you might think overall, well, I mean, obviously there are sort of responses that one might push to these lines of reasoning, and that the reading list for this week's topic includes readings that go into some of these responses. But if you find these responses, if you find these objections to presentism persuasive, you might think, well, look, we've ended up with a view that denies change and even denies identity across time. So, maybe this is kind of the worst of all possible worlds. The detractor of presentism might say. So we've quote unquote solved the problem of change by simply denying both change and denying identity over time, which were both things that we initially thought were plausible. So there are definitely things that the presentists might want to say in response, but that's a sort of key line of objection to presentism. If we're moved by this line of objection to presentism, and if we also found the objections to relationism, if we also find the objections to four-dimensionalism or Pergerantism persuasive, then we might be tempted to try an alternative version of endurantism. That is an alternative to presentism. One such alternative version is known as, well, sometimes relationism, sometimes relationalism. Different people use different terms, but they're picking out the same theory. So the relationalist is going to say that Hyperion doesn't have the intrinsic property. So I think, we'd ordinarily think of properties like height and, color, shape, and so on as being intrinsic properties. The relationalist is going to deny that any or they're going to claim that any property that changes over time or seems to change over time, they're going to say is not really an intrinsic property. It's not really an intrinsic property of an object. So if height changes over time, then it's not a genuine intrinsic property. If shape changes over time, like I'm fatter than I was when I was 20, so they'd want to say that that's not my shape isn't an intrinsic property of me, and likewise color. So think of an apple that goes from green to red to brown. Normally we think of color as an intrinsic property. The relationist is going to want to say, because it's a changeable property, it's not actually intrinsic at all. So why do they say that? So the idea is that what appeared to be changing intrinsic properties of objects are actually relational properties, and in particular their relations that the object bears to particular times. So the idea is, take the Hyperion example. So the property of being 116 meters tall, they're going to argue, isn't an intrinsic property of Hyperion, but rather it's a relation to a particular time, now, today, January 16th, 2021. So Hyperion bears this being 116 meters tall on relation to January the 16th, 2021, which is the date that I'm recording this. On the other hand, it might. I mean, maybe we could be more precise about heights. It might maybe it bears an ever so slightly different relation to tomorrow. It might be the height is slightly bigger, but that's irrelevant. It doesn't matter if there's the same height relation to different times. The point is that it can sometimes the height relation can vary, provided that relation is born to different times. So, for instance, in particular, although Hyperion bears there being 116 meters tall on relation to today, it bears the different being 1 meter tall on relation to Christmas Day 1221. So the reason they're adopting this strategy, this may be slightly unusual way of thinking, because they're taking what are normally thought of as intrinsic properties to be actually relational properties, relations to times, is because this helps avoid contradiction, right? So if it's not the case that the object has two incompatible intrinsic properties, which would seem to be a genuine contradiction, but rather it just bears different relations to different times, and there's no contradiction there. So the idea is there's no contradiction in supposing it bears the 116 meters tall on relation to today, but the being 1 meter tall on relation to Christmas Day 1221. So take an analogy. Now, maybe I'm currently 50 miles from Big Ben, and maybe I'm 300 miles from the Eiffel Tower. There's no contradiction between me bearing a relation of being 50 miles from to one object and 300 miles from to a different object, provided those are different objects that I bear the relations to. And so that's exactly what the relationist is saying goes with these properties that we originally thought were intrinsic, right? There's no contradiction between bearing the being 116 meters tall on relation to one time, and bearing the being 1 meter tall on relation to another time, provided that those are different times, right? It'd be a problem if it bore both the being 1 meter tall on and the being 116 meters tall on relation to the very same time. That would be a contradiction, but it doesn't. Okay, so maybe that's quite nice, and it's sort of weird. It's kind of weird to think, I think, of these properties as relational. Just ordinarily, maybe we think about them as being intrinsic. So maybe that's a bit of a step that you might be reluctant to make. But, I guess you might be able to persuade yourself that something like this is right. After all, when we talk about the heights of things, we often do qualify them with reference to times, right? So we might say that, the apple was green yesterday, it's red today, and it'll be brown tomorrow. So we might not be comfortable just with saying that the apple has just a particular definite color property, and to the extent that we do, we might just say, well, the apple's red because that's its property today. You might think, well, maybe that's just because if I'm talking about what it is now, then I don't really need to specify a time. That's the sort of default reading of what I'm saying. I'm just referencing the current time. So you might think maybe it's not a huge leap to think that it's sort of, at least implicitly in ordinary talk, our property attributions are kind of time relativized. So maybe we can get into a sort of relationist way of thinking, so it doesn't seem so bad to think of these like color properties and height properties as relational. But I think, nevertheless, there's maybe a more profound worry about relationalism. And I guess the worry is that it seems to mean that ordinary objects are going to have certainly far fewer intrinsic properties than we'd ordinarily think, right? So now it's starting to look like the color and height and shape properties of ordinary objects are not intrinsic to them. And it might be that we end up having to say that they have no intrinsic properties, or maybe far fewer than we'd ordinarily think. So I suppose if there are properties that certain objects have throughout their existence, then we wouldn't be forced to say that these were non-intrinsic. But for ordinary objects and for properties like color and shape and size, it certainly seems we're going to have to treat those as extrinsic or relational. And you might start to wonder whether it even makes sense to think of an ordinary object once we've kind of deprived it of at least the vast majority of its intrinsic properties. So is it really coherent to think about the notion of an object that is free or virtually free of intrinsic properties and merely stands in relations to other things? So that's quite a deep question, and you might argue that it is, but you might alternatively you might have worries about that. But we won't pursue that any further for the time being, though again, this is an issue that's discussed in some of the readings. Another sort of objection to relationism, one that should sound familiar by now because it's an objection or a kind of type of objection that's been levelled against all of the major theories that try to resolve the problem of change. And the objection is that relationalism denies the possibility of change. It denies that things really change. So we've already seen that sort of charge has been levelled against Pergerantism and also Presentism. The reason for the charge is slightly different in the case of relationalism. So in that case, it's going to say, well, according to the relationists, objects don't possess the sorts of properties that can change. All they possess are relations to times, and those relations to times are permanent, right? So if you think about the object Hyperion, the idea is going to be that it bears the being 1 meter tall on relation to Christmas Day 1221, and it bears a relation being 116 meters tall on to today, to January the 16th, 2021. But it looks as though those relations are permanent. If it always bears this relation of being 1 meters tall on to Christmas Day 1221, and it always bears the relation of being 116 meters tall on to the day 16th of January 2021. These aren't changeable properties, although we initially thought it had intrinsic properties that changed. It now looks like, on the relationist view, all it has are permanent relations to time. So change might seem to drop out of the account, you might argue. Okay, so again, I guess we could pursue this sort of line of objection. There are things that maybe the relationist could say. Maybe this is a sort of good enough surrogate for genuine change or something like that, they might say. But we'll press on, and I'll leave it to the reading readings on the reading list if you're interested in further pursuing these lines of thought. So the sort of third version of endurantism that we mentioned is adverbialism, and in a way this is like kind of a puzzling, maybe the most puzzling theory that we'll consider. So adverbialism says that when we say something like Hyperion is 116 meters tall on January the 16th, 2021. So in other words, when we attribute one of these temporary changeable properties to an object, the property attribution really is to be seen as functioning as an the temporal modification of the property attribution should be seen as functioning as an adverb. So if I say Hyperion is 116 meters tall on January 16th, 2021, then this temporal modification, this expression January the 16th, 2021, functions as an adverb. So what does that mean? Well, if a simpler case, at a sort of less controversial case, would be the word quickly in Bolt runs quickly. So if I say Bolt runs quickly, quickly is an adverb. It's modifying the verb, right? So the verb to run, where's the verb in this sentence, quickly modifies the verb because it indicates in what manner Bolt runs, right? He doesn't run slowly, he runs very quickly. And the idea is that, likewise, Hyperion isn't just simply 116 meters tall, nor is it simply a meter tall. Rather, it's 116 meters tall in a particular way, and it's a meter tall in another sort of way. Specifically, it's 116 meters tall in a, if you like, January the 16th, 2021 sort of way, whereas it's 1 meter tall in a Christmas Day 1221 sort of way. So this is an odd way of speaking, no doubt, but nevertheless, the adverbialist reckons this is the best way of overcoming the problem of change. Okay, so a sort of odd view, and I think it's fair to say that it hasn't proven as popular as the other views that we've discussed so far. Maybe because for some of the reasons that I'm about to discuss. So one is that there just seems to be something kind of mysterious about these sort of temporal ways of having properties. So I guess one way of cashing that out is to, remember we're doing metaphysics. So what exactly does this correspond to? I suppose I can get a sort of grasp of what it is for Bolt to run quickly. I could get an empirical handle on that. I can measure his speed and so on. What exactly is it for Hyperion to have the property of being 1 meter tall in a Christmas Day 1221 sort of way? In particular, so I guess if you're around in 1221, you could go and measure Hyperion and confirm that it is 1 meter tall on this day. But is this really a way of having the property of being 1 meter tall in the way that quickly is a way of running? I suppose one worry that people have had, and this is what I'm sort of getting around to saying, is that does this actually differ in any way from the relationist view? So are we just are we just really talking about the object having one property relative to one particular day, so understanding that as a relation to the particular day, and another property relative or in relation to another day. So you might sort of wonder, kind of ontologically or metaphysically speaking, exactly how this adverbialist solution differs from the relationist one. I think this is one sort of worry that people have. The familiar objection: does it really accommodate change? Right? This is maybe the most boring, because it just is another version of the same old objection that we've seen applied to the other theories of change. So you might say, look, this adverbialist solution isn't really giving us genuine change. It's more like denying genuine change. So it looks like on this proposal, actually Hyperion doesn't really have changeable properties. Rather, it just has the property of being 116 meters tall in a January the 16th 2021 way, and of being 1 meter tall in a Christmas Day 1221 way. And it just always, Hyperion just always throughout its existence has these properties in these ways, right? Nothing's really changing. It's not like it goes from being a meter tall in a Christmas Day 1221 way to being a meter tall in a different way, for instance, a January 16, 2021 way. No, it doesn't. It's not a meter tall in that way. So yeah, again, you might think, well, is this really a genuine account of change? And I think another sort of reasonable objection to adverbialism is just to say, well, why should we think that your appeal to adverbs, your notion that the temporal modifiers function as adverbs, really solves any contradictions, right? So just adding an adverb doesn't always solve a contradiction, right? So take Bolt, then if I say that he so one thing that Bolt can't do is both walk and run at the same time. That it would seem just a contradiction, say that Bolt is walking and Bolt is running, right? That just seems a contradiction. Now, just adding any old adverb isn't going to solve that contradiction, right? So if I say Bolt is running quickly, in a quick sort of way, and he's walking in a slow way, so he's walking slowly, the contradiction's not gone away. It's just as contradictory to say Bolt is running quickly and he's walking slowly as it is to say that he's running and he's walking. So not just any old addition of adverbs is going to help. So I guess there's a question, why would temporal adverbs help? Do they help? How do they help? So does a contradiction between Hyperion being a meter tall and 116 meters tall go away just because the properties are possessed in different ways? One in a Christmas Day 1221 sort of way, and one in a January the 16th 2021 sort of way. I mean, the adverbialists might sort of say it does, right? They might say that qualifying them with temporal modifiers works differently from the Bolt case, where we qualify with the modifiers quickly and slowly. But possibly we'd have to understand a bit more about what metaphysically this view looks like and how it differs from relationalism, if at all, to maybe be properly convinced by that. But that's enough for the time being. Now, okay, so we've considered Pergerantism and Endurantism, three versions of Endurantism. We've already considered some the ways in which they propose to deal with the problem of change, and we've considered some evaluation of the ways in which they seek to do so. So objections, for instance, to their attempts to deal with the problem of change. We might, though, take a more general view and say, well, more generally, let's bracket for now the question of the problem of change. Setting that aside, which is the better view, right? So is a sort of four-dimensionalist or Pergerantist view the better view, or is a three-dimensionalist or relationist view the better view, taking into account factors other than the problem of change? We might end up thinking that, well, if one view is much better generally, then we should just endorse whatever its solution to the problem of change is, provided that that solution is at least somewhat adequate. So I'm not going to go into this in any great detail. Some of you might have already picked up on this from the reading. Some would argue that four-dimensionalism or Pergerantism gains some support from modern physics. And like I'm not going to go into this in much detail. We're actually going to come back to think about modern physics, and in particular space and time in the context of modern physics, a bit later in term. So for now, and so the diagram on the right hand side of this slide is kind of just included for fun. It's not like I don't expect you to some of you might be familiar with space-time diagrams, Minkowski diagrams, but probably most of you won't be, and I'm not asking you to at this stage make any serious attempt to understand it. We're going to be talking about such things later in term, as I say. But just note for now that maybe there's some support for four-dimensionalism coming from modern physics. And I guess the reason for that is that in modern physics, there's no such thing as an absolute, or if you like, universal present, or at least so it seems. So what counts as the present differs from what's known as a reference frame, one reference frame to another. It's not a universal constant, if you like, or something that's invariant across reference frames. What counts as present depends upon your reference frame, and which reference frame you're in depends upon your velocity, it turns out, in modern physics. So interestingly, for someone who's standing on the surface of the Earth, what counts as present is going to diverge from what counts as present for someone in a spaceship who's maybe traveling at a significant fraction of the speed of light. So what's the consequence of that? Well, if we accept that apparent consequence of special relativity, immediately there seems to be a problem for the presentist, right? Because the presentist says that only the present exists, but now we find out that what's present depends on your velocity, or at least it seems so. But can we really endorse the idea that what exists depends on one's velocity, or that it's somehow relativized to a reference frame? A lot of people would worry about that. But sort of more generally, and again we'll see this later in term, what one finds is that in contemporary physics, and this is kind of related, although I won't go into the details, it's related to the idea that there's no sort of universal present. The distinction between space and time becomes a bit more blurred, right? So in contemporary physics, we tend not to make a sharp distinction between space and time, in a sense. We talk about points in space-time, so we talk about space-time rather than separately about space and time. And the diagram on the right of the slide is known as a space-time diagram. Now, so you might think maybe this is kind of grist to the mill of the four-dimensionalist, right? Because the four-dimensionalist argues that the four-dimensionalist argues that ordinary objects have spatial, but not just spatial parts, also temporal parts. And you might think, well, insofar as the distinction between space and time becomes a bit blurry or a bit muddy, maybe that seems like the right way to go. Maybe we should allow that, there's nothing particularly special about the spatial dimension, such that objects have parts in it, but not in the temporal dimension. So maybe the upshot's going to be that they have space-time parts or something like that. And maybe that looks more like a version of four-dimensionalism than three-dimensionalism. Anyway, we will, as I say, come back to that later in term. General objections to four-dimensionalism. Well, probably maybe it's a slightly less common sense view than three-dimensionalism, depending on which version of three-dimensionalism we go in for. So ordinarily when we speak of objects as opposed to events, we don't ordinarily speak of them as having temporal parts or somehow not wholly present at a given time. So there'll be something a little bit odd about saying that it's kind of not the whole of me that's recording this lecture. It's only a part of me. That would be an unusual way of speaking, but for the four-dimensionalists, they're going to have to claim that, literally speaking, that's true. Another sort of objection that you sometimes hear is that four-dimensionalists don't really give an account, a very clear account at least, of what a temporal part of an object is, right? Really what they give a couple of analogies, right? So they give an analogy with spatial parts of objects and with temporal parts of events, right? But they don't sort of give a direct account of what a temporal part of an object is. Now, it might be that ultimately that's reasonable, right? So it's quite difficult to give an account of what a spatial part of an object is. So you might think that, of course, it's going to be similarly difficult to give an account of what a temporal part of an object is. But anyway, this is something that maybe the four-dimensionalist ought to try to say something more about. What about three-dimensionalism? General advantages and disadvantages. Well, three-dimensionalism sort of in general, it may be more consistent with our ordinary ways of talking and thinking, right? So that's just the flip side of what I've just said. So it's sort of natural to think of myself as kind of wholly present giving this lecture. It's not only part of me that's giving this lecture, but the whole of me. So maybe it's more consistent with our ordinary talk and thoughts about objects, although maybe there are versions of three-dimensionalism that don't look quite so intuitive, right? So maybe adverbialism, you might think, well, or relationalism, you might start to think, well, is this really such an intuitive view after all? But sort of more generally, we might say, there's a way the four-dimensionalists might reply to this. They might say, look, actually, contemporary physics, in the form of special relativity, shows that there are problems with our ordinary ways of thinking about space and time, right? So I think ordinarily we think that, well, what's present for me is present for anyone else, right? There's a sort of objective, uniform present that doesn't depend upon velocity. But it looks like actually it's very difficult to make sense of that idea within special relativity. So the thought here would be that, well, if special relativity shows that many of our intuitions about space and time are mistaken, then maybe it's no surprise if our intuitions about what it is for an ordinary object to persist through space and time are also mistaken, right? It's natural that we should have to revise our views about persistence through space-time if our intuitive views about space-time are just wrong. Okay, so that's the sort of rejoinder that the four-dimensionalists might have. What about kind of further objections to three-dimensionalism? Well, I mean, I guess I've already sort of covered the first one on this slide. So maybe insofar as the distinction between space and time gets blurred in modern physics, the idea that there are spatially extended objects that have that have spatial parts and no temporal parts. Maybe that becomes a bit more difficult to make sense of. But as I say, we'll think about that more later in term. I guess another sort of objection is, well, the three-dimensionalist, in a sense, takes identity across time to be a brute fact, right? So the four-dimensionalist says that they give an account of what it is for an object to be identical across time, namely to have temporal parts, or in other words, parts existing at different times. So that, that's kind of on the model of an account of what it is to be extended in space. What it is to be extended in space is to have different parts occupying different spatial regions. So likewise, what it is on the four-dimensionalist view to be extended in time is to have parts that occupy different intervals of time, right? So in a sense, they've got an account of what it is for an object to exist across time. Whereas, obviously, the three-dimensionalist denies this account, but doesn't substitute an account in its place, right? So they take identity across time as just a sort of a primitive, a kind of unexplained fact. It just is the case that certain objects have identity across time. Obviously, one thing they do try to account for is how this is not a contradiction in terms, right? How, in particular, it can be reconciled with change. But they don't give an account of what identity across time per se consists in. And you might think, well, other things being equal, a metaphysical theory is better if it doesn't just take certain things to be brute facts, but tries to give an account of them. Okay, so I think, the jury's out, right? So none of the theories that we've considered today has been universally regarded as entirely defeated to this point. So each of the views, I think, still has some adherents. I'm not sure how many people adhere to adverbialism. That's maybe the exception, but certainly the other theories are all reasonably popular. The Temporal Parts view, the Presentist view, and the Relationist view. So the debate, very much is ongoing. I guess, like with many debates in philosophy, no knockdown arguments or universally accepted objections. And so, the debate continues to the present day. Okay, so that's it for this week. And next week, we're going to be shifting slightly. We're going to, as I've mentioned several times, come back to the theme of time and space. But we're going to move on next week to thinking about possibility, which is another very important, very central topic in metaphysics. So in the meantime, I hope you have a good week. And as usual, if you have any questions or issues, please feel free to drop me an email and get in touch. Okay, well, thank you very much for listening.